We're going to talk about the blood supply to the brain, and to start with we're going to have a look at the left ventricle. There's a aortic valve, and aorta goes out this way with ascending aorta, aortic arch, descending aorta, more in like a question mark shape. The heart sits at the level of T5 to T9, and the top of the aorta, the aortic arch, sits at around the T4 level. Aorta is divided into ascending aorta, and then is the aortic arch. And after around the level of T4, as it moves down from T4, starts the descending aorta. The descending aorta can be divided into thoracic aorta and abdominal aorta. Thoracic aorta starts, like I said, around the level of T4, and it finishes at around T12. The thoracic spine 12, which is the last thoracic spine, and it comes down to the level of L4, and it divides into common iliac arteries, which supplies the lower limbs afterwards. So T4, T12 and L4, some landmarks to remember. Talking about the blood supply, our heart's cardiac output rate is about 5 to 6 liters per minute. However, if you're exercising, this rate increases obviously, and if you're an elite athlete, it could go beyond 35 liters per minute. This output doesn't all go to, obviously, the brain. The brain takes about 15 to 20% of this output. Which means that at rest, the blood flow to the brain is about 0.75 liters to 1.2 liters per minute, which is quite significant. From the aortic arch rises our brachiocephalic trunk on the right side, and common carotid artery on the left side, and subclavian artery on the left side as well. Common carotid artery because it's going to divide into internal carotid artery and external carotid artery. And this part is subclavian artery, left. And left subclavian artery supplies the left upper limb. The brachiocephalic trunk that rose on the right side of the aortic arch divides into right subclavian artery and right common carotid artery. Right subclavian artery supplies the right upper limb, and right common carotid artery divides into external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. What's important about the subclavian artery is it gives rise to vertebral artery. So a little bit lateral to each side of the common carotid artery. Vertebral artery rises medially and superiorly and posteriorly. I wanted to draw a cervical vertebra. There's an articular process, and then a transverse process, vertebral body, transverse process, pedicle, articular process, lamina, and around the lamina there's a vertebral canal, and there is vertebral body. And the area that I'm interested in is the transverse foramina, right at the transverse process. So this is a superior view. The vertebral artery goes through these holes, transverse foramina, and again this is vertebral canal. Now the interesting thing about the vertebral artery versus vertebral vein is that vertebral vein goes through all the transverse foramina from 1 to 7, but for vertebral artery it goes from 1 to 6. Vertebral artery rises through the transverse foramina and it reaches the base of the skull. At the base of the skull it turns, makes a little round path, and goes in through the foramen magnum. And as it enters the foramen magnum, it pierces the meninges, dura mater, and arachnoid mater, and it goes into the subarachnoid space. Subarachnoid space contains cerebral spinal fluid. And it moves sort of in, converges. Now I want to draw what's behind it from the front. And somewhere there is back. Just gonna draw medulla here, and then there's pons. Oh, I need more real estate. So medulla, pons, and midbrain. That's our third cranial nerve, oculomotor nerve. At the base of the medulla, the vertebral artery starts to converge like so, and at pontomedullary junction it converges, and from pons it moves upwards. Around the superior part of the level of third cranial nerve, oculomotor nerve, it bifurcates, it divides in two, almost like an eyebrow. Now, and once they bifurcate at these terminal branches, they become posterior, Cerebral Artery. It supplies the occipital lobe. But before it gets there, there are many branches coming out. The first branching happens in the midway, and it becomes supply of arterial blood to the spinal cord. This one is called anterior spinal artery. Anterior spinal artery sits at a little groove, anterior median fissure. So let's consider spinal cord. Dorsal nerve root comes out, and then it forms a dorsal ganglion, and also there's a ventral root, dorsal horn, gray horn, ventral horn both sides, and dorsal horn. The point of interest is right here. This place is anterior median fissure, and this houses the anterior spinal artery. So vertebral artery continues along, and it again gives rise to another major artery, and it goes backwards like that. Mind you, as these vertebral artery moves up along the medulla, it supplies the medulla too. But that's not its main point. It actually supplies what's behind it, the cerebellum. It supplies the cerebellum, and hence it has a special name for it. Let me just draw a cerebellum behind it. So horizontal feature here of cerebellum. This artery is called Posterior Inferior Cerebellar Artery. In short, we can call it a PICA. Posterior Inferior Cerebellar Artery. And it supplies the posterior inferior side of the cerebellum. Now, as we move up, there's another important artery called posterior spinal artery. The tricky thing about this one is that it can either arise from the PICA, so as a branch from PICA, or it can arise from the vertebral artery. Person to person, it can vary. Let's say it's coming out from the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So it goes down and behind. And unlike the anterior spinal artery, posterior spinal artery doesn't converge, and it comes down in two separate canals. And this region where the posterior spinal artery passes is called posterolateral sulcus. Okay. Branching laterally is PICA, like I mentioned here, and another branch comes out, which is called Anterior Inferior Cerebellar Artery, ICA, in short. Now the ICA can arise from the vertebral artery or basilar artery. So for the ICA, Anterior Inferior Cerebellar Artery, it can arise at the top, near the top of the vertebral artery, or it can arise at the base of the basilar artery. Anterior Inferior Cerebellar Artery. So Obviously, as the name signifies, ICA, inferior cerebellar artery, supplies more anterior part, as opposed to PICA, posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So this should be longer, as you can imagine, than this, a bit shorter. Moving up is labyrinthine artery. Labyrinthine artery can also, there's a little confounding factor here. Some labyrinthine arteries come out from ICA. It can branch from the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. But some labyrinthine arteries stem from the basilar artery. Person to person, it can differ. It will supply the inner ear through internal acoustic meatus. Labyrinthine artery supplies the inner ear, and for that explanation, let me get more real estate. Let's picture the base of the skull. So these are basilar cranium, anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa. At the posterior cranial fossa lies the foramen magnum that I mentioned. So from here, the Vertebrobasilar artery came out. It pierced the dura mater and arachnoid mater to go into the subarachnoid space, to float in the cerebrospinal fluid, and then it converged, and then it rose up, and then it diverged to supply cerebrum, posterior cerebral artery. So this is a basilar part. After anterior inferior cerebellar artery, sometimes from the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, but other times coming out from the basilar artery, a little bit superior to the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, comes out the labyrinthine artery, and it moves laterally and it goes into a little hole, a canal, called internal acoustic meatus. So I'm gonna write that down. Meatus means canal, and essentially through the hole it comes out, goes in and supplies the inner ear. Let me draw some semicircular canals and utricle sacules and cochlear. So basically vestibular cochlear system. Vestibular cochlear system is the inner ear, and then there's a middle ear part and our external ear. External ear, middle ear, inner ear. And yeah, so through the internal acoustic meatus, the labyrinthine artery goes through and supplies the inner ear. There are other two nerves that goes through the internal acoustic meatus along with the labyrinthine artery. The other two nerves are 7th and 8th cranial nerve, the facial nerve and vestibulocochlear nerve. And vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 7, cranial nerve 8. Just to give you some brief idea what I drew here. The front part is anterior fossa, and this rather butterfly-like shape is the middle fossa, and the backspace is the posterior fossa, posterior cranial fossa. And the middle part over here is sella turcica, where the pituitary gland sits. The middle part over here is the deepest of the trough, and this part is the wall, and this part is the wall, and this wall part is called tuberculum sellae, and the back part is called dorsum sellae. Now, coming back, what happens afterwards? So we talked about labyrinthine artery. Moving up, we have small arteries that supply pons, and these bunch are called pontine artery. And then at the top of the pontine artery, another artery branches sideways bilaterally and supplies the cerebellum, and this one is called superior cerebellar artery. Superior cerebellar artery supplies the superior part of the cerebellum, and then it travels continuing upwards, branches outwards like so, and like I said, it becomes the terminal branch that supplies occipital lobe, called posterior cerebral artery. Posterior cerebral artery supplies the midbrain, of course. It also supplies a bit more deeper structure, thalamus, and it supplies inferior temporal lobe and inframedial temporal lobe. Before I go on to carotid system, which will be the next video, is the blood supply to the spine. The vertebral artery, anterior and posterior vertebral arteries are supplying the spine, but that's not the major supply. There are other major arteries that's coming from aorta, from the thoracic aorta and abdominal aorta, directly coming off it, and that supplies the spine more than anterior spinal artery, well, as well as posterior artery, posterior spinal artery. So aorta, let's consider that as an aorta, and common iliac artery, and at the sort of aortic arch, let me just divide it. So let's call that part the aortic arch part, and this part down is descending aorta. This part is thoracic aorta, abdominal aorta. From the aortic arch rises two significant arteries called ascending cervical artery and deep cervical artery. At the thoracic aorta rises posterior intercostal artery, and at the level of abdominal aorta rises the lumbar artery. So these are major arteries that supply the spine, but it doesn't do so directly. From here, they give rise to smaller arteries that supply the spine. These two divide into segmental arteries, so anterior and posterior segmental medullary artery, anterior and posterior segmental medullary artery, and 2 is radicular artery, anterior and posterior radicular artery. And they have the same name for the posterior intercostal artery and lumbar artery. So they 1 and 2 both happens here. 1 and 2 both happens here. Between these two, the segmental artery is a big one. They go inside the vertebral canal through the intervertebral foramen. Once it gets there, it separates into anterior part and posterior part. It supplies the spinal cord through anterior segmental artery, segmental medullary artery, and posterior segmental medullary artery. The segmental medullary artery is a bigger one. Radicular artery does supply the anterior spinal artery and posterior spinal artery, but they tend to supply more on the roots than the anterior and posterior spinal artery. They do have some contribution to the anterior and posterior spinal artery, but not as big as the segmental artery. But each one divides once it enters the vertebral canal, anterior part and posterior part, and then it supplies the anterior spinal artery and posterior spinal artery respectively. So that's sort of the overview of Vertebrobasilar artery, and on the next one I'm going to talk about Carotid artery, the anterior system, and we'll bring home by talking about how they converge through posterior communicating artery and forming circular villus and so forth. So talk to you then.